The startling discovery at an Ohio landfill. It was a bone-chilling morning in early December of 2005, one of those days when the cold felt like it could slice right through your skin. At the southern outskirts of Columbus, Ohio, a group of sanitation workers began their routine at the city's landfill. The air was heavy with the foul smell of rotting garbage and chemicals, a stench they had long gotten used to. It was just another regular day, or so they thought. As Joe Peters, a seasoned worker with over 20 years on the job, maneuvered his forklift up to one of the newer trash heaps, something unusual caught his eye amidst the sea of discarded waste. A large black garbage bag, punctured on one side, rested oddly on top of the pile. Its contents, partway visible, had a fleshy texture. At first Joe assumed it was a dead animal, probably a deer or maybe even a stray dog, which wasn't uncommon in these parts. "Hey Charlie," he called out to a coworker nearby. "Take a look at this! Someone's been dumping roadkill again." Charlie, a younger crew member who had only been on the job for 6 months, ambled over, hands stuffed in his coat pockets. "Let me see," he said, crouching down next to Joe. As the wind shifted, blowing the rancid smells of the landfill directly into their faces, both men recoiled in unison. Without touching the bag, Joe aimed the beam of his flashlight right into the hole. That's when they realized this wasn't your typical pile of trash, and it most certainly wasn't roadkill. Inside the torn bag was what unmistakably appeared to be human skin. Both men froze as the weight of their discovery sank in. "Jesus Christ, Joe," Charlie whispered, his voice trembling. Is that a person?" Joe didn't reply right away. His instincts as a landfill worker kicked in, and he fought hard to suppress the bile rising in his throat. Slowly, he reached out with a long stick to nudge the bag open further. It took a few tries, but when the contents finally spilled out, the sight before them was more horrifying than they could have prepared for. Staring back at them was a human head, severed cleanly, with grayish skin marred by frost and time. Around the head, scattered like leftover scraps, were more flesh-colored fragments. "Oh my God!" Joe backed away quickly, nearly tripping over a discarded tire. "Call the cops now." Charlie didn't have to be told twice. Fumbling for his phone, he dialed 911, his fingers shaking as he recounted what they had just found to the operator. "We're at Southridge Landfill," he stammered. We just found a human body part in one of the trash piles." The dispatcher's voice sounded calm, almost too calm for the gravity of what he had just described. "A body part, sir? Can you confirm what you're seeing?" "It's a head!" Charlie emphasized, nearly yelling. "A human head! It's not like, we're not mistaken!" He handed the phone to Joe, who took over the call with a steadier voice, providing the details as concisely as he could. Within 20 minutes, patrol cars and forensic units descended on the landfill. Officers began cordoning off the site while the workers huddled together a safe distance away, some muttering prayers under their breath, others unable to tear their eyes away from the gruesome scene. The ensuing investigation transformed the landfill from a site no one paid attention to into the epicenter of media frenzy. Camera crews and journalists swarmed outside its gates by noon, jostling for any scrap of information they could get. Joe was questioned multiple times throughout that day, though his initial recollection of events was painfully straightforward. "We just thought it was another trash day, you know," he told a detective, still shivering despite the heat cranked up inside the officer's car. "I can't believe someone dumped them here. Like they're nothing but trash." Meanwhile, the head and its surrounding remains were hastily transported to the city's forensic lab. Experts determined it belonged to a Caucasian male in his late 30s. The clean, surgical precision of the severance was chilling, sparking immediate theories among investigators. This wasn't the act of an amateur. Whoever had done this knew how to handle a knife. But the body part was just the beginning. Over the next few days, additional discoveries would turn Southridge Landfill into a somber crime scene. Pieces of a puzzle that unraveled a horror no one in Columbus could ever have anticipated. The once overlooked, sprawling grounds of the landfill had suddenly become the hiding place for secrets darker than anyone dared to imagine. Chilling discoveries around nearby areas. Once news of the gruesome find at Southridge Landfill hit the media, it planted seeds of fear and morbid curiosity within the entire Columbus community. The once quiet landfill now swarmed with police officers, forensic teams, and nosy neighbors peering at barricades from their cars, hoping for a glimpse of the action. Initially, the authorities tried to manage the situation quietly, believing it might be an isolated case. Detective Sam Bennett was assigned to lead the investigation. A no-nonsense veteran with nearly 2 decades on the force, Bennett had seen his fair share of ugly cases, but this one felt different right from the start. "You don't just find a head in a landfill without a story to follow it," he muttered as he scanned the crime scene details on his notepad, but the story was just beginning. "We've got something else, another bag!" shouted a rookie officer named Jordan Alvarez as he waved frantically from atop a mound of garbage, his latex-gloved hands gripping the black plastic sack. Interestingly enough, this discovery wasn't from the South Ridge landfill. It was from Greenfield Dump, another waste collection site 15 miles away. The call about a suspicious bag with a similar pattern had come in just days after the first body part was discovered. Detectives swarmed at the new location despite weather conditions worsening with icy rain pelting the ground. Bennett arrived quickly, shaking his head and muttering, "Does it ever just end in this job?" Inside the second bag they found another grisly revelation. 2 dismembered arms, neatly severed at the shoulder joints. Again, the cuts were unnervingly clean, like someone had studied anatomy. The details fit too neatly with the South Ridge case to ignore. "It's official," Bennett said grimly as he dusted off his umbrella and peered over the gory mess. "We're not dealing with just any lunatic. This is somebody who knows exactly what they're doing, and they're not stopping." Cautiously, the team broadened their search. Following these discoveries, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation ordered a systematic review of every garbage processing site in the northern counties. Protocols were set, with sanitation workers instructed to report any bag or item that deviated from the norm, especially anything resembling human remains. 3 days later, a manager from the outskirts of Franklin County placed another 911 call. This time it wasn't just another piece of the puzzle, it shocked even the most seasoned detectives. "We need a unit down here," the voice over the radio radioed into headquarters. "We've found another body part. It's a partial torso. No head, no arms. It's bad." Detective Bennett was there within the hour, his winter coat barely shielding him from the biting cold. The pungent stench of decaying waste hung heavy in the air, and the further he walked toward the investigation tent, the stronger it got. Though cleanup crews had cordoned off the area, a small group of reporters huddled with cameras on standby, trying to steal a glance from a distance. Bennett stepped inside the restricting yellow tape and eyed his partner, Detective Karen Douglas, who wore an equally grim expression. She'd been working on the ground with forensics all morning. "How bad is it?" he asked. "How much time do you have?" Karen replied through a deep sigh. She pulled out her notes. "We've got a male torso. Forensic estimates suggest he's in his mid to late 30s. No legs, no head, just the trunk. And get this," she said, lowering her voice. "The internal organs are missing." Bennett frowned, hands finding their way to his hips as he glanced back toward the uncovered remains. "Organs are missing? Like, someone took them?" Karen nodded grimly, flipping back to other notes. "The precision here is surgical, Sam. Just like the cuts on that head from South Ridge, whoever's behind this, they know anatomy. They're deliberate about what they want, and what they leave behind." Forensics confirmed it was the same killer when lab reports began to pour in later that week. In the flurry of activity, dispatcher reports began filling up with sanitation teams across the state, reporting more odd discoveries. Local dump sites as far north as Cleveland started reporting suspicious bags, but none yielded evidence as grim as what was found in Columbus. It seemed the killer's groundwork wasn't spread recklessly. They had deliberately chosen these landfills for a reason. Bennett needed to find out why. "This pattern can't just be random, right?" Karen said, leaning on her desk that same evening as the two combed through maps and police reports in a dimly lit briefing room. "Nothing about this is random, Karen," Bennett replied. "They're scouting locations. They know how these landfills work, which ones don't get monitored carefully. They're confident." "But why not just bury the bodies somewhere secluded? Why landfills?" Karen mused aloud, scribbling on a sticky note. Bennett frowned, looking down at the forensic photos from all 3 sites. The torso stared back at him in grotesque silence. "Because," he muttered under his breath, "they don't want these bodies to disappear forever. They want them to be found." The comment hung in the air between them like an ominous fog. Over the following weeks the narrative began to shift as more bags surfaced. Among the piecemeal body parts collected, the team was able to identify at least 3 different victims using advanced biometric analyses and dental records, though their names and occupations told little of their connections. What haunted Bennett more than the evidence itself was the timing. Each new find felt calculated, as if someone was controlling how slowly the story unfolded. "It's like a goddamn horror show piece by piece," Karen said one night after another grim development at the Greenfield dump. I don't get it, Sam. Why now? Why here? I don't know, Bennett murmured, staring at the red dots scattered across his investigation map. But what I do know is there's more out there. We just have to find it. Meanwhile, the media dubbed the anonymous perpetrator the Ohio Dismemberer, and the public frenzy over these discoveries gripped the entire Midwest. Speculation ran wild. Was it a vengeful ex-medical student, a failed surgeon, or was the killer sending a deeper message no one had cracked yet? Wherever the answers lay, one thing was becoming clear. The landfills of Ohio had become the burial grounds for something far more sinister than anyone had ever imagined. Signs from the killer's methodology detective Sam Bennett and his team gathered in the dimly lit conference room, their voices low as they combed through the mounting evidence. On the table before them lay stacks of gruesome photographs, each one a glimpse into the mind of a perpetrator unlike any they had encountered before. The cuts were too precise, the patterns too calculated. This wasn't just murder. This was method. Detective Karen Douglas broke the silence. "Sam, look at these," she said, holding up an autopsy report from the medical examiner. "It's not just the precision of the dismemberment, it's the level of expertise. The cuts through the bone, the way the joints were separated. It's like the work of a surgeon, or at least someone with an intimate knowledge of anatomy." Sam leaned forward, scanning the report. "Clean slices through the cartilage, no signs of hesitation," he muttered. "This wasn't a hack job. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Karen nodded. "And it's not just that. Look at this." She handed him a second report. "The forensic lab found something strange about the tissue. There are chemical traces in the wounds, some kind of preservation agent, almost like they wanted to keep certain parts intact." Sam raised an eyebrow, flipping through the pages. "Preservation agent? You mean like embalming fluid?" "Something similar but not quite the same," Karen replied. "The lab is still trying to pinpoint exactly what it is. Whatever it is, it wasn't used on the entire body, only certain parts were treated." "Certain parts?" Sam's voice hardened. "Like what?" Karen hesitated. "The brain," she said finally. "Or what was left of it. It's been removed in every victim we've found so far. Surgically." A murmur rippled through the room as the other detectives exchanged uneasy glances. Officer Jordan Alvarez, the rookie, broke the silence. "So, what? Are we dealing with some kind of organ trafficker, or is this guy eating them?" His voice faltered on the last word. Karen shot him a sharp look. "We don't know that. Let's not jump to conclusions." Sam folded his arms, his jaw tightening. "But it's not off the table, is it?" The room grew heavy with the weight of what they were discussing. Sam turned to Dr. Emily Carter, the forensic pathologist who had been working closely with the case. She had joined them for the briefing, her presence a silent acknowledgement of how unusually complex this investigation had become. "Emily," Sam said, "walk us through what you're seeing here. What does this tell us about who we're looking for?" Emily sighed, pushing her glasses higher on her nose. "Well, first things first, it's clear that this individual has training or experience in human anatomy. The precision of the cuts suggests they've either worked in a medical field or have studied it extensively. These aren't wounds made in a blind rage, they're calculated, intentional." She paused, glancing at the photos spread across the table. "And there's something else. The fact that the brains were removed, it's not just curiosity or random mutilation. This person is harvesting them." "Harvesting them for what?" Jordan asked, his voice rising slightly. "You're not actually saying—" "We don't know yet," Emily interrupted. "But the consistency of this pattern across all the victims tells me it's methodical, ritualistic even. They aren't just killing for the sake of it, they have a purpose." Sam exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "A ritual, great. Just what we need to make this even more twisted." Karen leaned forward, tapping one of the photos. "There's another thing that stands out. Look at the marks around the wrists and ankles. These victims were restrained, but the lack of bruising tells us they weren't fighting back. Either they were unconscious or—" She trailed off, her voice cautious. "Or they went willingly," Sam finished her thought, his tone dark. "Which means this person might be luring them somehow, gaining their trust or preying on vulnerabilities." "Exactly," Karen said. "And if that's the case, then our killer might be someone who's adept at blending in, someone who can appear normal, even charming." Jordan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "So what are we looking at here? Some kind of medical professional with a god complex? A failed surgeon? A sociopath who gets off on power?" "It's possible," Emily said. "But there's more. The use of the chemical preservative, it's sophisticated. This isn't something you just pick up at a hardware store. It suggests access to resources not available to the average person. Maybe through a lab, or an institution." You're saying they might have a legitimate job in the medical field, Sam said, his voice heavy with realization. It's a strong possibility, Emily confirmed. Or at least, they used to, Karen added. And the choice of victims, it doesn't seem random. They've all been young to middle-aged adults. No children, no elderly. It's like they're selecting people within a very specific range. Sam stared at the board covered in photos and notes, his mind racing. But why? Why take the brains? Why preserve them? Is it some twisted belief system? A delusion? Or are they selling them on the black market? Emily shook her head. There's no evidence suggesting any kind of trafficking ring, at least not yet. This feels personal, like it's for their own use. Karen's voice lowered. Maybe they think it'll make them stronger, smarter. God, Sam, what if they think it's some kind of cure for something? Sam didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned over the table, staring down at the images of the victims. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but resolute. Whatever their reason, we're dealing with someone who's thought this through. Someone who's patient, methodical. And until we figure out what's driving them, we're playing catch-up. The room fell silent as the weight of the case settled over the team. Outside, the city of Columbus buzzed on, oblivious to the darkness that had begun to engulf it. But inside that room, the detectives knew one thing for certain. Their hunt for the Ohio dismemberer was only just beginning. The scope of the crime scene expands. The discovery of severed body parts at 2 different landfills was horrifying enough, but as the days passed, it became clear to Detective Sam Bennett and his team that they were dealing with a predator whose reach went far beyond Columbus. The situation escalated when a sanitation worker at a smaller junkyard in Pickerington, about 20 miles from Southridge landfill, reported an eerily similar discovery. Fresh black trash bags containing what appeared to be human remains were found discarded near the back corner of the yard, hidden among bulk garbage. By the time Bennett arrived on the scene, local officers had begun uncovering additional remains, and the implications of these findings sent waves of discomfort through the seasoned detective. "Tell me we don't have another body here," Bennett muttered under his breath as he stepped out of his car. The pungent stink of garbage assaulted his senses before he even reached the investigation perimeter. He tugged his coat tighter against the December cold as he approached Officer Jane Morrow, the first responder on site. "You're not gonna like this, Sam," Morrow began, her breath visible in the frigid air. "It's the same as what you found at Southridge and Greenfield. Black bags, dismembered remains, clean cuts, and no identifiable clothes or belongings with the bodies." Bennett rubbed his temple with gloved fingers. "Jesus, same MO across 3 different landfills now, spread out over 20 miles. What about the state forensics team? Have they confirmed if these remains connect to the other victims?" "They're on their way," Morrow nodded. "But based on early observations? Yeah, it doesn't look random. Whoever did this is doubling down moving areas, it's a pattern." Karen Douglas arrived shortly after, arms packed with files as she strode up next to Bennett. "Sam," she said, handing him one of the folders, "I've got more for you to chew on. There are reports pouring in from other counties now. People are spotting these familiar black bags at dump sites everywhere. Circleville, Delaware, even as far out as Mansfield." Bennett's brow furrowed. "Mansfield? That's over 50 miles out." Karen nodded grimly. "Right. If the killer's spreading their disposal sites this far, it means 2 things. 1, they're trying to cover their tracks. And 2, she hesitated, lowering her voice, there's more than one body." Bennett sighed, flipping open the folder to review the latest reports. "What's the timeline on these new findings?" Karen tapped the map she'd brought with her, which was littered with small red pins marking landfill discoveries. "The first remains, the ones at Southridge, they were found less than a week ago, right? The remains from Greenfield came 2 days later. Now we're looking at fresh findings from Pickerington and reports trickling in about dump sites in at least 3 other locations. This isn't static, Sam. The killer's not just disposing of old bodies. They're active." Bennett groaned, pacing near the edge of the investigation perimeter. "Which means," he said, pointing to the map, "we've got a window here, a pattern to work with. They're operating in zones around Columbus, public, active locations with high trash turnover. Why these sites though? Why not just bury the bodies?" Karen joined him at the map, her voice tinged with frustration. "Because they want them to be found, Sam. Plain and simple. They're brazen, confident even. They're playing us. You saw the way the body parts were left, carefully separated, sanitized and wrapped like they're pieces of some goddamn puzzle." "The killer's picking locations that blend into the chaos," Officer Morrow added. "No one watches who dumps trash at these places. Half the county could be using a landfill any given week. But why spread out? Karen countered, gesturing at the map again. It can't just be convenience. If you're trying to avoid detection, you don't risk driving all over Ohio with body parts. That adds exposure. Risk. Unless the killer has reason to move around, Bennett interjected, his gaze narrowing as he stared at the growing cluster of red pins. Either they're traveling for work, or they know these landfills, picking them deliberately. Karen raised an eyebrow. You think they've got insider knowledge like someone working in the waste industry? Or someone who studied it, Bennett replied. Look, think about it, they know the schedules, the low traffic hours, spots on the periphery that don't see a lot of turnover. They're plotting these dump sites like a goddamn road map. There was a long pause between the detectives as they both stared at the sprawling region marked by their map. The implications of Bennett's theory chilled Karen to the bone. If you're right, she murmured, we're not just dealing with someone who's smart, Sam. We're dealing with someone who plans, who's guessed every move we'll make before we make it. Bennett didn't answer right away. His mind was already racing toward the next step. Broader sweeps of dump sites, interrogations of waste management employees, and increased checkpoints for suspicious vehicles. But in the back of his head, a gnawing doubt lingered. Was it already too late to stop this killer before they dumped their next message? If this is all part of the plan, Bennett said quietly, more to himself than anyone else, then we've got a long way to go before we catch up. By the following week, the number of confirmed body dumps had risen to 6. With each discovery yielding remains of a new victim. As Karen had predicted, forensic analyses revealed patterns not only in the precision of the dismemberment, but in the timeline too. Detectives soon realized that the killer seemed to be disposing of bodies in regular intervals, every 5 days. We're watching this unravel in real time, Karen said during yet another strategy meeting. They're taunting us, Sam, leaving just enough breadcrumbs to keep us moving in circles. More reason to stay one step ahead, Bennett replied, rubbing the exhaustion from his eyes. We tighten patrols around every landfill in Franklin County and start monitoring transfer stations too. If the killer wants us to find the bodies, then fine. But the next time they make a drop, we'll be waiting. The investigation hits a dead end. Days stretched into weeks, and despite the growing number of discoveries, the investigation began to stall in ways that left Detective Sam Bennett and his team grasping at loose threads. For every potential lead they stumbled upon, it seemed like 2 more questions emerged in its place. The pressure from the media and the public was relentless, and the once confident team was beginning to feel the weight of doubt creep in. We've got nothing, Karen said one afternoon, tossing a file onto the conference table in frustration. A pile of similar incomplete reports surrounded it. Dental records don't match anyone in our missing persons database. Prints are useless because most of the remains don't even have recognizable hands, let alone fingers. And the DNA analysis? It's a waiting game. Sam flipped through a forensic update without looking up. No IDs, no connections between victims. It's like they don't even exist. His typically steady voice had an edge of fatigue. How do 7 people just vanish off the grid without anyone noticing? Across the room, Officer Jordan Alvarez sat upright in his chair, daring to interject. Is it possible they were off the grid, sir? People no one was looking for? Homeless, undocumented individuals? Karen tilted her head, considering it. It's possible, she admitted, but even in cases like that, somebody notices eventually. A shelter worker, a friend, someone, and most serial killers don't target purely transient populations. Too unpredictable, too random. Sam rubbed his temples. It doesn't fit the pattern here. This guy is methodical. He's selecting his victims deliberately. Age, physical similarity, the condition of the bodies. Whoever they are, he's not picking people who just happen to wander into the wrong place. Then why can't we find any damn reports about them missing? Karen shot back. We've combed through local hospitals, police reports from neighboring counties, social services, hell, we even checked with immigration. Nothing. A heavy silence settled over the room. The enormity of their failure felt suffocating. Outside the precinct walls, the city of Columbus buzzed on, blissfully unaware of just how little progress had been made in stopping the person responsible for turning landfills into graveyards. At that moment, Dr. Emily Carter, the forensic pathologist, entered the room, clutching a folder that looked thicker than any of the previous observations she'd submitted. You all look like you could use some bad news, she quipped dryly, though her tone held no real humor. Well, if it's bad news it'll fit right in, Sam replied as he gestured for her to sit. What do you have? Emily exhaled as she set the file on the table, spreading out another series of macabre photographs of the dismembered remains. I thought I'd start with confirming what you already know. Every single body we've processed so far shows evidence of surgical precision in the dismemberment. All the markings indicate someone with either formal training or significant experience in anatomy. Right, we've been over that, Karen said, leaning back in her chair. What else? Emily hesitated before flipping to another set of notes. This part might explain why identifying the victims has been so difficult. I went back and examined the bone structure in more detail, particularly marks along areas like the jaw and ribcage. And? Sam asked, sensing the pause wasn't for dramatic effect, but because Emily was preparing them for something significant, or horrifying. And many of the teeth, nearly all of them, have been altered or removed post-mortem, she said, her tone measured. Whoever this person is, they deliberately destroyed any dental record that could connect us to their past. In some cases, they removed them cleanly. In others, they used blunt tools to smash them beyond recognition. Karen muttered a string of curses under her breath. So they're wiping out identifiers, making sure we never link the remains back to names. Exactly, Emily confirmed. But it's not just the teeth. Bone marrow samples we've taken from certain victims are oddly degraded, as if exposed to chemicals before or after the bodies were dismembered. It's possible the killer is doing this to corrupt any DNA testing we might try. That's insane, Jordan whispered, staring at the photos in disbelief. They're going this far just to stay anonymous? Sam folded his hands on the table, deep in thought. No, it's not just about staying anonymous. This much effort means they know exactly how the system works, where our weak points are. They're using that knowledge against us. Emily continued, her voice tinged with frustration. And then there's this. None of the victims have any viable prints left intact. Fingers are scraped raw, in some cases intentionally burned. I can't definitively say yet, but it looks like they're actively removing every legal trace of who these people were. Karen leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. This isn't just a killer, Sam. This is someone playing a very long game. They don't just want to kill. They want to erase their victims completely. No names, no histories, just pieces left behind in some godforsaken landfill. And they're doing a damn good job of it, Sam replied, his voice cold. We have nothing to go on for profiling. Without IDs, we can't connect the victims to each other or figure out the motivation behind the killings. And without motivation, we're chasing shadows. The group sat in grim silence. Outside, snow began falling, covering the streets of Columbus in a thin white layer. It was almost poetic how tranquil everything seemed beyond the chaos within the precinct walls. Finally, Karen spoke, breaking the stillness. So what now? Do we just keep searching landfills until this psycho gets bored and stops? Sam shook his head firmly. No, they won't just stop. If anything, they're escalating. The precision, the effort. This is someone who's just getting started, and if we don't find a crack in their process soon, anything, they'll keep going. It's not just about solving this case anymore, it's about preventing the next one. Then we need to change our approach, Karen said. If we can't identify the victims, we need to stop focusing on who they were and start digging into the how and why. What's connecting the locations, the method, the timing? Sam nodded slowly, his mind already turning over possibilities. Agreed. But we have to act fast, because if this person is methodical enough to erase their victims from every conventional system, then they're already miles ahead of us. And with that, the team returned to combing through the mountains of partial evidence, each member silently wondering if they were chasing a ghost no amount of police work or time could ever catch. Suspicious anomalies found in the bodies. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during what felt like another fruitless week in the ever-growing investigation. The remains from several landfills had been sent to Cincinnati's top forensic facility for a more thorough analysis. The lab, equipped with some of the most advanced tools in the state, processed every bone, tissue sample, and fragment from the 7 bodies found so far. It was there that the lead forensic examiner, Dr. Rachel Kim, discovered something unusual, something that would alter the course of the investigation. The following morning, Detective Sam Bennett and his partner Karen Douglas sat in a small, sterile conference room at the Cincinnati lab. The walls were bare except for a dry erase board filled with scribbled notes and a diagram of the human body, meticulously labeled. Dr. Kim entered, her expression focused, carrying a file thicker than any of the previous reports they'd seen. "This is big, isn't it?" Karen asked, picking up on Rachel's tense demeanor. Rachel nodded, setting the file down and pulling out a series of X-rays. "I think we just uncovered the most critical evidence in this entire case." Sam leaned forward, elbows resting on the table. Show us. Rachel spread the X-rays across the table, her finger tapping on one particularly striking image of a skull. Of the 7 victims we've identified so far, or should I say, parts of 7 victims, 4 of them share a very specific anomaly. Their skulls were opened post-mortem with the removal of brain tissue. But what's disturbing isn't just that the brains were removed, it's how they were removed. Karen frowned, narrowing her eyes at the X-rays. How so? Rachel grabbed a pointing tool and gestured toward the fine, clean lines on the images of the skulls. These are surgical cuts. Not guessing, not hacking, this was done with precision tools, likely something like a cranial saw. Whoever did this didn't just want access to the brain, they wanted to extract it whole and intact without damaging it. Sam's voice was sharp. You're saying they were harvested? Yes, Rachel confirmed. And it wasn't done sloppily either. This wasn't a butcher wielding a hacksaw. This was someone with surgical training, or at the very least someone who studied craniofacial anatomy extensively. The removal process is consistent across all 4 victims. And the other 3 victims? Karen asked, flipping through the notes, a sick sense of dread building in her chest. They didn't undergo the same procedure, Rachel said, but tissue samples from their brains were still missing. It's possible the killer wasn't able to harvest them intact, but they still took parts of the brain where they could. This suggests that the brain isn't just incidental, it's the target. Sam leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, his mind racing to connect the dots. Why? Rachel, tell me you've got an idea why anyone would go through this level of effort. Rachel's hesitation was palpable. There are some possibilities. One is purely pseudoscientific. An old myth that consuming the brain grants intelligence, power, or some sort of spiritual awakening. It's an outdated and dangerous belief, but it has appeared in various cultural contexts. The precision here, though, makes me think there's something else going on. A delusion grounded in reality, Karen murmured, her eyes glued to the X-rays. This guy thinks he's... what? Collecting brains for research, for consumption? For some twisted experiment? That's something I can't answer yet, Rachel admitted. But there's another detail you need to know. All 4 of the skulls show evidence of a highly unusual chemical residue where the brain once was. Chemical residue? Sam tilted his head. What kind of chemical are we talking about, like embalming fluid? Not quite, Rachel said, sliding another page across the table. It was a chemical analysis report, the jargon thick with scientific terminology. We're still narrowing it down, but it's a compound used in preservation, possibly synthetic. It's meant to slow decay and keep tissue from breaking down. Whoever did this didn't just take the brains, they're preserving them for some reason. Karen looked genuinely horrified. So they're not discarding the brains either, they're keeping them? Exactly, Rachel said grimly. If there was any doubt before, this confirms that this isn't a mindless killing spree. There's intent. This individual is taking the time to carefully plan every step of this process. Sam ran a hand down his face, exhaustion written in every line of his expression. All right, so, let's summarize what we know. This isn't about rage, it's not about money, at least not directly, it's about the brain. They're specifically targeting it, and whoever's doing this is knowledgeable, patient, and willing to take enormous risks. Karen's mind was already leaping ahead. The preservation agent, it's important. You said it's synthetic? Could it lead us anywhere? Are we talking hospitals, laboratories, medical supply companies? It's possible, Rachel replied. But it's not something you can just grab off a Walmart shelf. This chemical would require access to specialized resources, supplies you'd typically find in a research lab, extreme embalming work, or other niche markets. If we can figure out where they're getting it, it might give us a lead. Sam tapped his fingers on the table, the spark of determination returning to his eyes. Then that's what we focus on. Rachel, push this chemical residue analysis to the state's forensics department. Get them to cross-reference it with recent purchases or theft reports at any medical or research facilities. Karen, let's pull up any cases involving medical professionals in Ohio who've been fired, discharged, or suspended in the past 5 years. I don't care if it's for malpractice or stealing pens from the break room. Anyone with access to this kind of knowledge is a potential suspect. Karen nodded, already jotting down notes. On it. But Sam, if I may, this changes the stakes, doesn't it? We've gone from hunting some deranged psycho dumping bodies in landfills to unraveling the agenda of someone who thinks they're bigger than that, smarter than us. Sam didn't respond right away, his focus shifting to the X-rays again. Those neat, haunting cuts through the skull lingered in the back of his mind. Finally he spoke, his voice low and steady. We've always been dealing with someone who thinks they're smarter than us, Karen. But they messed up. They left their projects behind for us to find, and sooner or later we're going to figure out why." The room fell into a tense, buzzing silence, and Rachel cleared her throat. "I'm going to keep digging on my end. I'll let you know if we uncover anything else, but for what it's worth, you're not looking for someone hiding in plain sight. You're looking for someone who thinks they're untouchable." "Not for long," Sam said, standing up and grabbing his coat. "Not if we have anything to say about it." Tracking a person of interest. The break in the case wasn't dramatic, but it was notable enough to reignite hope in an investigation that had felt increasingly futile. It began with a single garbage worker, a man named Ron Castillo, who recounted a curious memory during a routine police follow-up at a landfill in Pickerington. Ron's statement wasn't much, but it gave Detective Sam Bennett and his partner Karen Douglas something to work with. Ron was leaning against a dirty utility shed, sipping his black coffee when Sam and Karen showed up one icy January morning. "Detective Bennett," Ron greeted. "Look, I don't know how much help I can be, but, I remembered something strange." Ron's tone caught Karen's attention immediately. "Strange? We're all ears," she said, pulling out her notepad while Sam gave a small, encouraging nod. "Well, it was a guy," Ron started, furrowing his brows in concentration. "This was weeks back. I didn't think anything of it then, but now it sticks out. He came in on a gray pickup, late model, something like an old F-150, kept to himself, bundled up pretty tight, but the thing is, he was unloading all these big black bags into the pile." Sam leaned forward. "Black bags? How many? Did they look like the ones we've flagged as evidence?" Ron took a deep sip of coffee, clearly trying to recall details. "Could have been 3, maybe 4, and yeah, they were big. He struggled a bit getting them out of the truck bed. Now that you mention it, they did look similar to what you folks showed on the news." Karen glanced at Sam, who nodded for her to keep going. "Did you get a good look at him?" she asked, her pen poised over the pad. "Age range, height, distinguishing features?" Ron shook his head regretfully. "Not much, no. It was freezing, so he had this old knit hat pulled low and a scarf wrapped up pretty high on his face. Felt like he didn't want anyone to see much of him, you know, but I'd say medium build, maybe late 30s or 40s, and, oh, his hands. He had gloves on, but they were weird, like thick rubber gloves. It stuck with me because it didn't seem normal for just dumping trash." The mention of gloves made Sam sit up straighter. "Thick gloves? Rubber, you said? Like something you'd see in a medical lab?" "Exactly," Ron confirmed. "Like the kind you'd wear if you didn't want to get anything on you." That single detail sent murmurs of unease through the two detectives. Sam exchanged a look with Karen, his mind already turning. "Ron," Sam said, his tone urgent, "did you get the license plate or anything else about the truck?" Ron scratched his head, squinting as though he could will the memory into focus. "Partial plate, maybe? Damn, I didn't think to write it down. I know it started with an H5 or something similar, and it had one of those Ohio farm use tags on it. That's about all I can remember." Karen jotted down the information swiftly before giving Ron a reassuring smile. "That's more than enough, Ron. You might have just given us the lead we've been looking for. We'll take it from here." Back at headquarters, the team dove into the investigation with renewed fervor. Sam stood near the evidence board, reviewing Ron's description of the mystery man in the truck. Beside him, Karen was typing furiously into her laptop, cross-referencing vehicle registration records. Officer Jordan Alvarez joined them moments later, holding up a printout. "This may help," Jordan said, slapping the papers down on the conference table. "We've narrowed down Ford F-150S in the area, with H5 in their plates and farm use tags. Came up with a list of 8 potential matches." Sam quickly scanned the list. "8's manageable. Let's run them all. Owner backgrounds, addresses, work histories, the works. Also cross-check those names for anything in their files. Suspicious charges, medical histories, anything that sets them apart." Karen nodded as her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her face tightening slightly. "You're not going to believe this," she said, setting the phone down. "One of the names, Derek Harrison, has a prior's record. Assault charges from 6 years ago. Bar brawls, nothing huge, but here's the kicker. His last known address is a farmhouse on the outskirts of Franklin County." "Franklin County," Sam repeated, his tone sharp. "That's ground zero for most of the landfills we've tied to this case." Karen nodded grimly. "It gets better. He was arrested, but not convicted, for animal cruelty charges 2 years ago. Neighbors reported seeing him bring back stray animals in the middle of the night. Police found remains buried on his property, dogs, cats, all dissected. No one could prove it was him, though, claimed it was coyotes." Sam's jaw tightened as he stared at Harrison's name circled on the list. A guy with a violent past, a history of dissection, and a property sitting smack in the middle of our dumping zone, he's not just a person of interest, he's our prime suspect. By the next morning, a decision had been made. Armed with a search warrant, the team mobilized to Harrison's property. Sam and Karen arrived in an unmarked vehicle while a convoy of officers followed closely behind. The farmhouse was secluded, surrounded by overgrown grass and rusted machinery, a perfect hideaway for someone who didn't want to be disturbed. The first thing Sam noticed was the truck parked under a dilapidated carport. Gray, late model. A closer look revealed farm use tags and an H5 on the license plate. "This is the place," Sam muttered, his breath visible in the frigid morning air. Karen nodded, her hand resting on the holster at her side. "Let's hope he's home." The knock on the door went unanswered, so the team broke through. The interior of the farmhouse was sparse, cold, and eerily quiet. It didn't take long before they found the unmistakable signs they were searching for. In the basement, beneath piles of old tarps, was the evidence that tied Derek Harrison directly to the case. A stack of black garbage bags, identical to the ones found in the landfills. Alongside them was a collection of tools, saws, scalpels, and industrial gloves, that looked as though they had been cleaned recently. On a dusty workbench sat jars of chemicals, labeled with handwriting too messy to decipher. Sam stood grimly in the corner, his flashlight illuminating the grim scene. "This guy," he muttered, shaking his head, "he thought he'd get away with it." Karen picked up one of the jars, careful not to disturb the label. "Preservatives, just like the residue Dr. Kim found in the remains." "This is it, Sam, he's the one." But the most damning evidence was in a corner freezer, humming softly. Inside they found what they'd feared, a frozen brain, perfectly intact and preserved. Derek Harrison was detained hours later at a bar in a neighboring county. He denied everything at first, as most suspects do. But as police cataloged the evidence at his farmhouse, there was no escaping the truth. Harrison had left behind far too many clues for it to be anyone else. For Sam and Karen, the hunt wasn't over. They still didn't know why Harrison had harvested those brains. But one thing was for sure, the man behind the garbage bags was no longer untouchable. The gift from the young witness. It happened on a quiet, gloomy afternoon when the investigation had once again reached a frustrating standstill. Detective Karen Douglas was at her desk, eyes glazed over as she flipped through old case files. Sam Bennett was pacing the room, his frustration evident in the tight set of his jaw and the sharp rhythm of his footsteps. Even Jordan Alvarez, the rookie who usually buzzed with energy, sat slumped over his laptop, absent-mindedly poking at his keyboard. The phone rang, cutting through the stuffy silence. Karen was closest, so she answered. "Detective Douglas," she said, her tone clipped and professional. "Hi, this might sound silly," came a hesitant voice on the other end, "but my son says he found something weird near the landfill." Karen straightened in her chair. "Weird? Can you be more specific?" "Well, he said it's a bag. He was playing out there earlier today. I've told him 100 times not to go near that place, but you know kids, and he said the bag had bones in it, human bones." That got Karen's full attention. She motioned to Sam, who stopped pacing immediately. "Okay, ma'am. First, is your son safe? Is he still out there?" "No, he's home now," the woman replied quickly, her voice shaky. "He didn't touch it other than to peek inside, thank God. But he swore there were bones in that bag." "All right, stay put. We'll send someone over to your home to talk to him, and we'll check out the site. What's your address?" Karen scribbled the details down as Sam grabbed his coat, already nodding toward the door. When they arrived at the modest suburban home, the boy, a wiry 10-year-old with big brown eyes and messy hair, was already waiting for them with his mother at the door. "Mom doesn't want me to talk to cops," he blurted as soon as Karen knelt to greet him. "She thinks I'm in trouble." Karen laughed softly, shaking her head. "You're not in trouble at all, I promise. In fact, you might be helping us. What's your name?" "Ethan," the boy replied, his fingers playing nervously with the hem of his shirt. "Well, Ethan," Karen said with a warm smile, "can you tell me what you saw?" Ethan's mother gently nudged him forward, and he began to speak, his words tumbling out quickly as if he were afraid he'd lose his nerve. "I was playing by the fence near the landfill, just kicking rocks, you know? And then I saw this big black bag. It didn't look like the normal kind people throw out. It was tied up weird." "What do you mean weird?" Sam asked, crouching a little so he was on the boy's level. "Like, tied all careful, like someone didn't want it to come undone." Ethan's face grew serious. "I got curious, so I poked it with a stick, and it kinda opened a little. That's when I saw the bone. And some skin. I think it was a leg. I didn't touch it though, I swear. Karen exchanged a tense glance with Sam before turning back to Ethan. Do you remember exactly where you saw it, champ? Could you show us? Ethan nodded quickly. Yeah, it's by the fence under some old tires and junk. You can see it from the big tree near the road. Sam smiled at the boy. That's really helpful, Ethan. You did the right thing telling us. Within the hour, Sam and Karen had arrived at the site Ethan described. The landfill was sprawling, a chaotic expanse of debris and waste stretching as far as the eye could see. Following Ethan's directions, they trekked toward the back of the landfill where the terrain grew steeper and less maintained. There, Karen said, pointing. Peeking out from beneath two rusted tires was a black garbage bag, tied in the exact way Ethan had described. Sam approached it cautiously, slipping on gloves before prodding the bag with a stick. When it shifted, a pale fragment of bone came into view. A sickeningly familiar smell hit both of them at once. Jesus! Karen muttered, pulling her scarf up over her nose. Sam grimaced but didn't flinch, carefully cutting the bag open with a utility knife. Inside was exactly what they had feared, dismembered remains. A leg, severed neatly at the knee, the flesh pale and cold. Beside it, more fragments of flesh and bone were tightly packed, almost as if whoever had dumped the bag wanted to ensure nothing spilled out. Another drop, Sam said grimly, his voice tight, and it fits the pattern. Karen scanned the area, her eyes narrowing. But why here? Why this spot? This isn't where they've dumped before. Maybe this one wasn't planned, Sam suggested, pulling out his phone to call the forensic team. Maybe the killer was rushed, couldn't get to a landfill they've used before. Or maybe they're testing our response time. Karen frowned, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she stared at the black bag. Or they're getting bolder. If a 10-year-old can stumble onto this, it means they're getting sloppy, or they just don't care anymore. Later that evening, Ethan and his mother visited the station to provide an official statement. Ethan, still wide-eyed but visibly proud of his role in helping the detectives, recounted his story in precise detail. As they left, Karen knelt down to thank him again. You did something really important today, Ethan, she said, smiling at him. You might have just helped us stop someone who's hurt a lot of people. Ethan beamed, and for a moment, Karen caught a glimpse of the resilience and determination that made her believe in justice, even after years of witnessing humanity's darker sides. As the boy and his mother walked off, Sam leaned against the edge of his desk, watching them go. You think this'll lead anywhere? He asked quietly. Karen didn't hesitate. It has to. This kid just gave us a trail to follow. Now it's on us to follow it to the end. Sam nodded, his jaw tightening with renewed resolve. Then let's make it count. And with that, the team dove back into their work, every small lead breathing new life into their relentless pursuit of the killer. The killer and the chilling confession. It wasn't easy getting Derek Harrison into the interrogation room. He was calm, too calm, almost eerily so, as the officers led him through the precinct. His wrists in cuffs, his stride nonchalant, and his expression unreadable, Harrison acted as if being brought in for questioning was just another ordinary day. The faintest smirk tugged at his lips, as though he enjoyed being the center of attention. Detective Sam Bennett sat waiting inside the gray-walled room, the table before him bare except for a case file and a black mug of lukewarm coffee. Karen Douglas was stationed behind the one-way glass, watching every move Harrison made as he entered the room and was guided to the seat opposite Sam. Harrison slouched in the chair, letting out a long sigh like a man settling into his favorite recliner. Well, Derek, Sam started, his tone flat and measured. Let's see if you can impress me as much in here as you apparently like to do out there. Harrison tilted his head, a smirk forming fully across his lips. Detective, he said, his voice unnervingly soft. Impressing you isn't exactly on my to-do list. Karen shifted her weight behind the glass, arms folded tightly, eyes locked on Harrison's demeanor. He's playing games, she muttered to herself. This bastard thinks he's untouchable. Doesn't matter, Jordan Alvarez replied from the corner of the observation room, clutching the file of evidence they'd carefully assembled. Sam will break him down. Give it time. Back in the room, Sam stared at Harrison with unflinching focus. We have your truck, we have the garbage bags, we have the tools, and we found the remains in your basement freezer, specifically the brains. You're not walking away from this, Derek. Harrison leaned back casually in his chair, almost as though he wasn't hearing a word Sam was saying. You must think you've got it all figured out, don't you? He replied, his voice dripping with quiet amusement. Sam didn't blink. "I don't need to have it figured out, that's for the court and the jury. My job's just to put the facts on the table, and buddy, let me tell you, we have all the facts we need." But Harrison didn't flinch. He cocked his head to the side, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Do you?" he asked almost playfully. "I mean, I bet you've got all kinds of little puzzle pieces, don't you? The bags, the saws, the leftovers." He chuckled darkly at his own choice of words. "But you don't know why, and that must eat you up inside, detective." Sam inhaled deeply, keeping himself steady. He'd dealt with killers like this before, people who thrived on control, who fed off the frustration and desperation of their hunters. This wasn't Derek's first time enjoying the power dynamics in the room, but Sam had no intention of giving him the satisfaction. "You're right, Derek. I don't know why. But I think you're dying to tell me," Sam said, leaning forward on the table. His voice dropped low, almost daring. "Because as much as you like to act calm, cool, collected, you're desperate for someone to know how smart you think you are, how meticulous, how you pulled this off." "That's where you're wrong," Harrison said, his smirk faltering just a fraction of an inch. "It wasn't about outsmarting anyone." Karen leaned closer to the glass, her eyes narrowing as she watched Harrison's smirk begin to falter. "Then why?" Sam pressed. "Help me understand. You kill 9 people. You dismember them. You preserve their brains but leave their corpses to rot. You take all these risks, crossing half the county to dump remains in landfills. For what? What drives you to do something like that?" For the first time, Harrison hesitated. His smirk faded entirely now, replaced with something darker, deeper. He tilted his head forward, staring at the table between them as he spoke. "They were supposed to save me," he said quietly. Sam didn't move. His gaze bore into Harrison, his voice calm and firm. "Save you from what, Derek?" Harrison's fingers curled into fists on the table. He looked up, his expression suddenly raw, a mix of desperation and anger. "My brain's broken," he spat through clenched teeth before leaning back in his chair. "Doctors say I've got degeneration, that I'll lose myself piece by piece. First my memory, then my coordination, and then... eventually I'll just be another vegetable in a hospital bed." "So you thought taking theirs would fix you?" Sam's tone was steady, but the disgust was clear in his eyes. "You thought harvesting minds would save your own?" "You don't get it!" Harrison snapped, his calm demeanor cracking, the smirk gone completely now. "I wasn't just tearing through junkies or lost souls, all right? I chose them. They were healthy, sharp, people who never smoked, never drank, never rotted themselves the way normal people do. Do you know what kind of discipline that takes? You think I picked them at random?" A wave of unease passed through Karen and Jordan as they listened behind the glass. Karen clutched her arms tightly, struggling to keep herself from storming into the room. "You thought by eating their brains, preserving them, that you'd somehow cure yourself?" Sam asked, keeping his voice emotionless. "I studied it," Harrison said matter-of-factly. "You wouldn't believe the things you can find if you know where to look. Old studies, myths. Some scientists theorized it once, a concept of absorbing neural activity, accessing their essence." "Essence? Are you even listening to yourself?" Sam's voice rose slightly now, unable to keep his anger completely at bay. "You're telling me you killed 9 people because you believed you could steal their mental strength, their health?" "I didn't believe," Harrison whispered, leaning forward. "I knew. It should have worked." "But it didn't," Sam finished coldly. For a moment the room fell silent. Harrison didn't respond, his shoulders shrinking just a fraction. Whatever control he thought he had, whatever masterful plan he thought would work, had failed. "No, it didn't," Harrison admitted finally, his head dropping. Sam sat back, exhaling deeply as he steeled himself. "You can frame this however you want, medicine, mythology, desperation, but at the end of the day, you're a murderer. You took their lives, and you destroyed countless others in the process." Harrison didn't respond. He simply sat there, staring down at the table, whatever twisted bravado he carried before drained out of him now. Behind the glass, Karen exhaled sharply, stepping back from the panel. "What a sick delusional psycho," she muttered. "But at least we have him. There'll be no walking away from this." "No jury's gonna have sympathy for a brain-eating narcissist," Jordan added grimly. As Sam stood and exited the room, Karen met him in the hallway. "He'll plead insanity," she said immediately. "He can try," Sam replied, "but we've got enough evidence to prove how methodical he was. Insanity won't save him." Karen nodded, her jaw tight. "Let's make sure it doesn't." That night, as the precinct grew quiet, the weight of Harrison's confession lingered over the entire team. He wasn't just a killer, they were dealing with someone who had convinced himself his actions were justified. But now, with his words on record and the evidence stacked against him, one truth had become clear: his reign of terror was finally over. Twisted psychology behind bars. The room reeked of bleach and stale air as Detective Sam Bennett entered the sterile confines of the county jail's observation corridor. The clinking of keys echoed through the hallways, accompanied by the muted conversations of guards and inmates. It had been 6 weeks since Derek Harrison's capture, and in that time every attempt to understand his actions had led to a deeper spiral of bafflement. Harrison wasn't just a killer. They now knew that he was meticulously calculating and disturbingly deluded. Karen Douglas stood waiting for Sam outside the small interrogation room where Harrison was being held. The fluorescent light above flickered occasionally, casting long, ominous shadows. She looked up as Sam approached, her expression unreadable. "I can't believe we're doing this again," Karen muttered, crossing her arms. "He's already confessed, Sam. Why are we even entertaining a psych eval?" Sam let out a tired sigh. "Because the brass wants more insight into his motives. They think it'll help during trial prep, make the jury understand exactly what we're dealing with here. They want us to pin down whether this guy is truly insane or just a cold, calculated bastard." Karen scoffed. "Oh, he's calculated. Insane people don't clean their knives before using them again, and they certainly don't think to scrub their crime scenes with goddamn industrial bleach." "Maybe, but that's not for us to decide," Sam replied, his voice low. "That's what the shrinks are for." From inside the room came the soft scrape of metal as Harrison shifted in his seat, cuffs clinking against the table. He looked as calm and indifferent as ever when Sam and Karen stepped inside, flanked by a prison psychologist, Dr. Madeline Ferris. Harrison sat slouched, his head tilted slightly to the side like he was bored with the whole ordeal. "Detectives, my favorite people," Harrison drawled, flashing a faint smirk. His eyes flicked briefly to Dr. Ferris before settling back on Sam. "And who's this? Do I finally get my therapy session?" Dr. Ferris ignored the taunt as she placed her files on the table and took a seat across from Harrison. "Mr. Harrison, I'm here to perform a psychological evaluation. It's not a conversation about guilt or innocence, but rather about understanding you and what motivates your actions." "How thrilling," Harrison replied dryly, leaning back in his chair. "Let me guess. You're here to figure out whether I'm a sociopath, a psychopath, or just hopelessly misunderstood." "Something like that," Dr. Ferris said calmly, flipping open her notebook. "But it only works if you're honest with me. Can you try that?" Harrison's smirk deepened. "Oh, Doc, honesty is one of my many virtues." Karen, standing by the wall with her arms crossed, let out an audible scoff, but Dr. Ferris pressed on undeterred. "Let's begin with your childhood, Derek. Tell me about your upbringing." Harrison waved a hand dismissively. "The usual story. Suburban home, 2 parents, 1 dog, dad coached baseball, mom baked cookies. Is that what you want to hear?" Dr. Ferris raised an eyebrow. "I'd like to hear the truth." He paused, staring down at his cuffed hands like he was weighing his next words. Finally he said, "All right, fine. Dad was a drunk who thought his belt was a better teacher than any school. Mom, she cried a lot but never stopped him. You know, your standard childhood trauma. Satisfied?" Dr. Ferris took a moment to jot down a note before continuing. "Do you think your experiences growing up influenced your actions later in life?" Harrison laughed, an empty, joyless sound. "Influenced me? No, Doc, you've got it all wrong. My family didn't turn me into what I am. If anything, they delayed my potential. They wanted me to be normal, play along in their little suburban fantasy, but I've always known I was different." "Different how?" Dr. Ferris asked, keeping her tone neutral. Harrison leaned forward, his previously cocky demeanor replaced with something darker. "Different as in smarter, sharper, more observant. I see what other people can't or won't. Most people walk through life in a fog, too blind or too scared to acknowledge the things I've learned to accept." Karen shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening across her arms. "And killing people is part of that acceptance?" she asked sharply, unable to stay silent any longer. Harrison turned his gaze to her and smiled, like a predator sizing up its prey. "Killing them wasn't the point, not really. The point was survival. Mine." Sam stepped closer to the table, his voice low but firm. "Let's cut the crap, Harrison. You harvested their brains. You mutilated them. That doesn't sound like survival, it sounds like sadism." "Sadism would imply I enjoyed it," Harrison said coolly. "And I didn't. I hated every second of it, but it was necessary." "Necessary for what?" Dr. Ferris pressed, clearly refraining from showing any judgment. Harrison leaned back again, his smirk returning. "You already know the answer to that, Doc. My brain, my precious broken brain. The doctors told me I'd lose it, that it would decay piece by piece, but I wasn't going to let that happen. Do you know how many studies exist about neural regeneration? How many theories suggest it might be possible to absorb strength from other brains? I didn't make this up. I followed the science. Karen let out a bitter laugh. The science? You butchered people based on pseudoscience you found in some dark corner of the internet. Give me a break. Oh, detective, Harrison said, grinning wider. Mock me all you want, but I gave it a shot. I didn't want to die drooling into a pillow. I took control. Dr. Ferris watched him closely, her expression calm but her pen moving furiously across the page. And how do you feel now, Derek, knowing that it didn't work? For a split second, a shadow crossed Harrison's face, something raw, almost vulnerable, but just as quickly it was gone, replaced by his usual smug indifference. It was worth the risk, he said flatly, even if it failed. Sam exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. You're a murderer, Harrison. No justification changes that. You didn't just experiment. You destroyed lives, families. And yet here I am, Harrison interrupted, his smirk widening, alive, breathing, which is more than I can say for the 9 contributions to my research. Karen stepped forward, her anger visibly boiling over. You think this is a game? You think you're untouchable? Let me tell you something, Harrison. When you're rotting in solitary confinement for the rest of your miserable life, no one's going to remember how clever you think you are. All they'll see is a coward who hid behind a butcher's knife. For the first time, Harrison's composure seemed to crack. His smirk faltered, and his gaze dropped briefly to the table. But he recovered quickly, shrugging theatrically. We'll see, detective. Plenty of time for reflection, right? Dr. Ferris concluded her notes, closing the file with a soft thud. I think we've heard enough for today. As the guards entered to take Harrison back to his cell, he turned to Sam and Karen one last time, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. Always a pleasure, detectives. Don't miss me too much. As the door slammed shut behind him, Karen let out a frustrated groan. He's deranged, completely out of touch with reality. Maybe, Dr. Ferris replied, tucking the file under her arm, but he's also calculated, almost terrifyingly so. He's not insane in the legal sense, no matter how much he wants us to think otherwise. Sam nodded grimly. Then we make sure the jury sees him for what he is, a killer who thought he could play God. Karen crossed her arms tightly, her jaw set with determination. Let's make sure he never gets the chance to hurt anyone again. As they left the room, the weight of Harrison's twisted worldview lingered like a shadow, a grim reminder of just how warped the human mind could become. The haunting aftermath. As the dust settled after Derek Harrison's trial and conviction, the scars of the case lingered throughout Ohio. It wasn't just the visceral horror of what he had done, it was the way his crimes wormed their way into the collective conscience of everyone who had come into contact with them. The families of the victims, the communities that felt violated, and the investigators who were left questioning the very limits of human depravity. Detectives Sam Bennett and Karen Douglas had become the reluctant faces of the case. They had tried to move on, carrying the weight of their own haunted memories as quietly as possible, but the public had been relentless in its fascination with the story. News stations had sensationalized the trials, talk shows dissected every minute detail of the investigation, and true crime podcasts treated Harrison's case as a grotesque form of entertainment. One cold January evening, months after Harrison had been sentenced, Karen found herself sitting across from Sam in the precinct's break room. The room was cold, its fluorescent light humming faintly above their heads. A half-empty coffee pot on the counter had burned old grounds to a bitter sludge. She stirred her cup absently, her eyes distant. "You ever think we missed something?" Karen finally asked, breaking the silence. Sam leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. He didn't look up immediately, choosing instead to trace a faint scratch on the surface of the table with his thumb. "Missed something like what?" Karen shrugged, her expression taut. "I don't know, a bigger pattern, another victim, or maybe a way to stop him sooner." Sam's brow furrowed, his tired eyes meeting hers. "Karen, you know as well as I do, we can't think like that. We followed every lead, turned over every stone. We caught him. He's not out there anymore." "And yet," Karen said, trailing off. She stared into her coffee as though it held answers. "He's still here, in everyone's heads. I still see his name in the papers, on social media. People analyze him like he's some tragic anti-hero out of a horror movie, like he's something to study. Meanwhile, the families of his victims are out there picking up the pieces of lives he shattered." Sam rubbed his temple, a familiar ache setting in. I know, believe me, I know, but that's not on us, that's not a failure on our part. It feels like it is, Karen said quietly. 9 people. 9, Sam. And for what? Some delusional pseudoscience he cooked up to save his own skin? And even now he gets to rot away in a prison cell while the rest of us deal with watching his shadow stretch over everything he touched. Sam set his coffee down, leaning forward in his chair, his voice softened. You're not wrong. The guy caused damage that goes way beyond the victims' bodies. But if you think I could have stopped him sooner, could have buried myself deeper in that case and somehow caught him before he killed more, you're out of your mind. He was meticulous, Karen. He was smart, and yeah, he's twisted as hell, but twisted doesn't mean stupid. We stopped him, that has to be enough. Karen's lips tightened, her gaze flickering toward the door as though she was searching for a way out of the conversation. What about the families? Do you think it'll ever be enough for them? The haunting impact of Harrison's crimes rippled far beyond the courtroom verdict. Many of the families of his victims struggled to reconcile the nature of what had happened. For them, it wasn't enough to know Harrison was behind bars. There was something uniquely horrifying about the precise, grotesque nature of his murders, something unnatural and incomprehensible that left open wounds in their psyches. One of those families reached out to the detectives, a man named Peter Wyatt, whose younger brother Adam was one of Harrison's final victims. Peter had stayed quiet throughout the trial, never speaking to the media and rarely showing up except for necessary testimony. But on a particularly bitter evening, as Karen shuffled piles of case files on her desk, Peter Wyatt appeared unannounced. His face was pale, his eyes hollow like a man struggling to carry an invisible weight. Karen looked up, startled. Mr. Wyatt, I didn't know you were coming. Peter waved away the formalities. I wasn't planning on it, I needed to say something. To someone who'd understand. Karen gestured to the chair across from her. Sure, please, sit. Peter hesitated before taking the seat, his hands knotting together in his lap. Karen could see the exhaustion etched into his face, the way his voice trembled when he finally spoke. Every time I think about Adam, Peter began, I can't stop wondering how much he suffered, if he knew what was going to happen to him, if he tried to fight back. And every night I ask myself the same question, why him, why my brother? What made Adam stand out to a monster like Derek Harrison? Karen instinctively reached across the desk, lightly placing her hand on his. I can't even begin to imagine what you and your family are feeling, Mr. Wyatt, but I can promise you this. Your brother didn't die because of who he was. He died because of who Harrison is. Sick, paranoid, twisted. Adam wasn't targeted because of anything he did or said. He was targeted because Harrison wanted him to keep some sick fantasy alive. Peter nodded faintly, his eyes welling with tears he tried to blink away. I try to focus on the fact that Adam was kind, you know? I try to tell myself that's what matters. But instead, all I ever think about is those black bags, those landfills, all the things you find out when you read too much about the case. Karen felt her throat tighten, a pang of guilt surfacing. Maybe you shouldn't keep looking, Peter. Sometimes it's okay to step back. You shouldn't carry the same darkness that Harrison left behind. Peter's smile was faint, bitter. Easy for you to say. You get to close the file and walk away when it's over. For me, it's never over. Later that evening, Karen stayed late at the precinct, staring at the board of victim photos and evidence like it was a puzzle she could somehow solve differently. Sam wandered back in, his coat slung over his shoulder. You're still here? Sam asked, raising an eyebrow. Thought you were heading out. Karen shook her head, gesturing to the wall. You ever think about how this is going to stay with them? Those families? Like Peter Wyatt? He came by today. Sam frowned. Wyatt? What did he want? To tell his story, I guess. Or maybe just to make sure someone else remembers what Adam was like before all this. I don't know, Karen muttered. Sam sighed, setting his coat down and pulling up a chair beside her. What we do, this job, it's never going to fix what's broken, you know that. But it's not for us to carry every piece of it either. Karen didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. It feels like it shouldn't just end like this, with him in a cell and 9 families putting the pieces back together on their own. Sam glanced at the board, Harrison's mugshot staring back at them like some grotesque reminder of how far people could fall. Maybe it doesn't end here, but at least we stopped it from getting worse. Karen allowed herself a faint nod. Yeah, I guess that has to mean something. The clock ticked quietly in the background as the precinct settled into its late-night stillness, and for the first time in weeks, Karen felt that maybe, just maybe, stopping the bleeding would have to be enough. The butcher's fate, and a lesson to remember. It had finally come to an end, or at least that's what everyone wanted to believe. In the winter of 2006, Derek Harrison entered the final act of his gruesome saga, the sentencing phase of his trial. After months of harrowing investigations, heart-wrenching testimonies from the victims' families, and endless media scrutiny, a unanimous jury decision landed him on death row. But even with the legal system having delivered its final verdict, the legacy of his actions wasn't so easily closed. The courtroom had been packed to capacity on the day of the sentencing. Every seat was taken, every corner of the room crowded with reporters, sketch artists, and members of the public, eager to witness the culmination of what had become one of the most infamous murder cases in Ohio's history. Standing at the defense table, Harrison looked unnervingly composed, as if this wasn't the moment his life was being sealed. His expression was empty as Judge Elizabeth Crane read the jury's unanimous recommendation, the death penalty for his 9 counts of first-degree murder. Detective Sam Bennett sat in the back row, his hands clasped in front of him, watching the sentencing with quiet resolve. Beside him, Karen Douglas studied Harrison's profile, her eyes narrowing as she tried to read what, if anything, the man was thinking. "You'd think this would feel more satisfying," Karen muttered under her breath. Sam, without looking away from the front of the room, nodded. "Yeah, you'd think." Judge Crane's voice broke the silence. "Mr. Harrison, the court has found your actions to be not only premeditated and calculated, but also cruel and inhuman beyond comprehension. There is no aspect of justice served that allows you to be reintegrated into society. You are hereby sentenced to death." Harrison didn't flinch. He simply stared forward, emotionless. A few murmurs rippled through the courtroom, followed by the soft sound of several family members exhaling together. Relief, grief, acceptance, all tangled into one agonizing breath. Peter Wyatt, who had been seated a few rows ahead of Sam and Karen, turned briefly in their direction. His face was calm but strained, a hardened mask of someone who had survived unimaginable pain but would forever shoulder the scars. "He hasn't said anything," Peter whispered to Karen when the courtroom briefly emptied for a recess. "In all this time, he hasn't apologized. Not once." Karen didn't know what to say. She glanced at Sam, who finally broke the silence. "I don't think an apology would mean anything, Peter. Some people, they don't see their victims as people. To him, they were parts of a puzzle, that's all." Peter nodded, his lips pressing into a tight line. "You're right, but still. I keep hoping I'll see something in him. Regret. Or guilt. Anything human." Karen placed a hand on Peter's shoulder. "Harrison doesn't get the power to give you closure. You and your family, you get to make your own peace, with or without him." Death row. Despite the verdict, the appeals process dragged on for years, as was the norm in capital cases. Harrison's lawyers mounted every possible challenge to delay his execution, citing his unstable mental state, and claiming that his degenerative brain condition had impaired his ability to make rational decisions. They tried to paint him as a victim of his own disease, a twisted shadow of what he might have been, had his brain not betrayed him. It wasn't convincing, not to the courts, and certainly not to the families of his victims. With every headline announcing another appeal, Karen couldn't help but feel the sting of disbelief. "Unstable mental state?" she said one day as she and Sam sat in the precinct's break room going through a stack of cold cases unrelated to Harrison. He planned every single step. He used the internet to research brain preservation techniques, chose his victims based on their physical health, and cleaned every crime scene meticulously. This guy had more focus than most of us on our best day. Sam leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. "His lawyers are just doing their job. They'll drag out the process as long as they can. Whether we like it or not, that's the system." Karen shook her head. "Meanwhile, the families are stuck in this purgatory. Every year Harrison gets to file for another appeal is another year those people can't move on." "I know," Sam said softly. "But you and I both know the appeals won't save him in the long run. One day, this ends." Karen exhaled sharply, her frustration clear. "Not soon enough." A lesson in evil. By the time Harrison's final appeal was denied in 2013, most of the public had already moved on to the next high-profile case, the next scandal, the next distraction. But for the detectives, prosecutors, and families, his execution felt like an inevitability looming over them. The question wasn't whether justice would be served, but whether it would ever feel like enough. In the years following the case, Ohio implemented tighter regulations for identifying and tracking mental health risks in individuals with violent tendencies. Harrison's crimes became a grim reminder of what could happen when dangerous signs were ignored. His methodical actions, coupled with his delusions, exposed glaring holes in the intersection of mental health care and law enforcement. Sam found himself speaking at a seminar for young officers in 2014. Karen, seated in the audience, watched as he addressed the case with the same quiet intensity that had driven him throughout the investigation. "People will tell you the Derek Harrison case was about evil," Sam said, his voice firm but measured. "And yeah, maybe some of it was, but mostly it was about blind spots. Harrison wasn't an invisible monster. His arrests for animal cruelty and assault were signals. His fascination with anatomy, his isolation, these were signals. We didn't connect the dots until it was too late." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle on the room. "Your job isn't to assume evil is hiding in every shadow, but if you see the signs, if they don't add up, don't ignore them. Ignoring it could mean the difference between catching a guy before he kills and finding pieces of 9 bodies spread across landfills." Later, as they left the seminar, Karen walked beside him in the brisk evening air. "Nice speech," she said lightly, tucking her hands into her coat pockets. Sam glanced at her with a wry smile. "You're going to make me regret it, aren't you?" "No," Karen said, her tone softening. "It needed to be said. God knows someone should have said it to us years ago." Final thoughts. Harrison's execution came quietly on an overcast evening in late summer. There were no protests outside the prison, no candlelight vigils, no television crews camped out with live coverage. For most of the world, his name had already faded into the annals of infamous killers. For Sam, Karen, and the families of those he'd murdered, it wasn't validation, it was simply the end of a terrible chapter. Karen drank her coffee in silence the morning after, staring out the precinct window as the city went on with its day. "What now?" she asked Sam as he approached her desk, a fresh stack of new case files in hand. "Now we keep working," Sam said, "because there's always another one out there." Karen gave a faint nod, her gaze lingering on the city streets. "And maybe next time we catch them before there's a next victim." "Yeah," Sam said quietly. "Maybe." The lesson left behind by Harrison was clear. Justice doesn't erase pain, and vigilance doesn't erase failure. But for those who carry the burden of stopping monsters, it's the only way forward.